All right, so welcome to this session, the second of 3 live sessions today as part of the Scottish Cosmopolitanism at the Siècle project. This second session is called Debates in Scottish Cosmopolitanism at the Siècle, and we're trying to set it up as a round table. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen there, and so we've got 4 key participants who are going to speak to us today. For each of them, there are video segments that you can watch if you haven't already, that are available via our project website and that will remain on that project website, so you can consult them at any time. I should also inform people that this session is being recorded, and we will release this session onto the project website too, so that anybody who isn't able to attend can watch at a later date. So, as I say, there are video segments from each of the 4 presenters today. What I'm going to do then for this session is introduce each speaker, and after I've introduced them, following the order that was announced on our project website, I'm going to ask each of them to give a sort of 5-minute response or summary of the material that they raised in their video segments, and then I'll open up questions and answers. I'll have about 15 minutes, and then I'll move on to the next speaker, and then there might be some time, I'm hoping there'll be some time at the end of the session for general questions and answers. I'm going to give participants in the round table first opportunity to ask questions of each other, but I'm also hoping to use the Q&A function of Zoom for this session. So if you have any questions to put to presenters at this session, please click the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and I will relay that to presenters at the appropriate time. I've kept the chat option open, I think, for this session. So if you do want to discuss with other attendees, I think you'll be able to address people via chat in the chat box while discussion is going on, live discussion is going on. Okay, that's enough by way of preamble from me. I want to move on to the first presenter. So the first presenter is Richard Hibbett, who's a senior lecturer from the University of Leeds. I know Richard, having worked with him on the Decadence and Translation project. Richard's work is wide and varied. His first book was a book about dilettantism and its values. He's also edited translations of Tristan Corbière and Verlaine, and written on those writers, but he also has an interest in the work of W.G. Sebald, which we haven't talked about yet and need to at some point. As I say, I came to know Richard through the Decadence and Translation project, but also as one of the key contributors to a special issue of Comparative Critical Studies on fin de siècle cosmopolitanism. And Richard's going to talk to us now about cosmopolitanism in France at the end of the 19th century. I'll stop talking and hand over to Richard. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you also, Michael, for setting up this fantastic project and bringing us all together. And thanks very much to everybody out there who is listening. I wanted to start by just mentioning perhaps some points of convergence. Having watched and listened to the videos from the fellow panelists, but also having watched and listened to Stefano's talk this morning, I thought it might be useful just to mention a few points before I go back to my own little segment. Stefano spoke about how cosmopolitanism is not a consensual term. And I think that's a very important point when we think about my own area, thinking about the French fin de siècle usage, but perhaps in general. It's not only ambiguous. Stefano ended by obviously talking about the painting and thinking, well, do we see it in terms of good and bad cosmopolitanism? And that's certainly one way in which we can start thinking about it. You know, if it's seen as something which is suspicious or morally suspect, or if it's seen as something which is too idealistic or utopian. I would say you go beyond this ambiguity. It's something which is polyvalent. And not only is it polyvalent, and therefore because it's polyvalent, it's something which is also slippery. It's quite hard to get hold about what it means. It means different things to different people in different languages and different periods. So we need to historicize it. But one of the problems I found when I've been trying to historicize it is how difficult it is. It's very hard to reconstitute a history, even for the French definitions, let alone from looking across it on a global scale. So it is polyvalent, but also even when people think they know what it means or how they use it, they can have a deep ambivalence to it. So there's a second level of uncertainty going on. But I'm going to propose we should see this obstacle, as we were talking about this morning, as something which is actually quite fruitful. It doesn't mean we just need to give up trying to get a handle on it. There's certain ways and some very fruitful ways we can apply various definitions retrospectively to look at this particular period. So that's what I took from Stefano. What I took from Jerry, I think was particularly interesting in terms of thinking about the importance of recognizing the regional space, and also thinking about cosmopolitan is not always synonymous with urban. It's not always synonymous with national in the sense of canonical or official in the terms of who's dominating the media, but particularly in terms of literary history. I found Jerry's talk looking back, thinking, well, actually, we need to rethink our history, particularly useful in this context. I don't know much about Stevenson. I studied French and German. I spent the last 30 years trying to do an English degree in my spare time. Haven't quite got to Stevenson yet, unfortunately. But I think I know from various other colleagues who've worked on Stevenson and French writers, there's some interesting connections there. Dostoevsky was the one other thing that I took from Jerry's talk. And what's interesting about Dostoevsky comes up, as you might have seen in some of the French writings and thoughts about cosmopolitanism, how Dostoevsky in particular give a certain type of not only mysticism, but also spirituality. So if we're moving towards some kind of model for cosmopolitanism, it may not necessarily be the French, it may be elements of the Russian, elements of the Scandinavian, or maybe it's a mistake to try and think we have to have one particular model, it's a hybrid model. So I was interested in that. Coming to Benedict's talk, and of course there were some interesting crossovers between Jerry and Benedict, and I was thinking particularly about the references to Belgium here. And if you think about Belgium and Switzerland as well, in a sense, you've got Francophone literature before we think about Francophone literature, thinking about what the French means in that particular context, being part of a French literary tradition and a French literary scene, but also not necessarily thinking about what it means in French in terms of identity. So I thought that was particularly useful in terms of thinking away again from certain models of thinking about particular center, periphery. The peripheries themselves become actually more important. And you might think of Casanova again in this context, what she writes about Glasgow and Edinburgh, for example, or other cities, about how you have some interesting relationships. The model between France and Belgium is a famous one for Casanova. Belgium perhaps becoming even more avant-garde than Paris by the end of the 19th century. It's interesting to see how that works in other examples. Finally, coming to Alex, well, I found, of course, from the theoretical point of view, this was particularly useful. The year that Stefano and I published the special edition that Matthew mentioned on Fin de Siècle Cosmopolitanism was a year in which James Ingram's book came out, and it didn't get into that because of that reason. It would have been very useful for us. But particularly this notion of the cosmopoetical took me back to thinking about Homi Bhabha, because it's a term that he ends up using himself in the 1990s when he's thinking through the notions of vernacular cosmopolitanism. And what I particularly liked about Alex's talk is how he was able to suggest how we might be able to use these particular models as a constructive way of thinking back about the fin de siècle. And it's not only, of course, thinking again about the Kantian model, but it's also thinking about different ways about how we nuance this model. Can we have a concentric model of identity with a more fluid and interstitial one? Is it possible for these two models to work together? I think it is. The crucial thing, of course, is to go away from obviously this binary model, accepting the use of these, to the value of these particular terms, the national and the cosmopolitan, but also thinking not necessarily only about the tensions between them, but also about the productive elements of these particular tensions. And I mentioned Alexander Beecroft in my little video as well, because he writes interestingly in the context of world literature about the tensions between the national and the cosmopolitan model, and how 19th century is where you see them particularly, but of course his argument is that we still see them today. And in fact, sadly enough, from my point of view, in the UK, or at least in the English and Welsh curriculum, you see a certain retrenchment of a national view of literature in the way that we teach literature. So that's just a few general points of convergence. And then I'll just talk a few words about my own video. I'm not going to go through the whole thing again, but it was very interesting thinking about it in the light of hearing these papers and thinking about other people's ideas. What I wanted to do in my talk was talk about how the notion of cosmopolitanism in the fin de siècle in France is very specifically intertwined with a debate which is going on in journals at the time. And it comes from what you might think is a rather innocent and value-free way of thinking about literature, just an openness to the foreign. So we see this open to the Russian novel, but also to the Scandinavian novel and to other literatures, but how immediately that becomes political in the sense that it can be used in a different way and it can be co-opted for different reasons. So you get these positive uses, particularly in the 1880s. Broadly speaking, by the time you get to the 1890s, you see some form of backlash. You see that in Maurice Barrès, Paul Bourget's book Cosmopolis is a famous example of that. Also in critics like such as Jules Lemaitre, and a protectionist view. And this argument carries on between these various critics, but then the term tends to disappear. It tends to go, and of course you think about the Dreyfus affair, when it suddenly seemed to be a form of internationalism, inevitably with these connotations of anti-Semitism. And I mentioned this in my video, and it's a fairly controversial thing to say, but only fairly recently, Bernard Kouchner, at this time, who was a foreign minister in the French government, said, well, I know what you mean when you're calling me a cosmopolite. I know what you mean. I know you're implying there's an anti-Semitic slur there. So there's a very specific element to those French uses as well. I thought Catherine Barry's article was particularly interesting because she's done all that work of reading these articles and tracing this particular debate. And then just to say a few more words about the French conclusion, I mentioned, of course, what's interesting about the French, not only do we see this inherent polyvalence and the ambivalence towards it, but also this strange paradox. And it's something that you might think when you think about the revolution and the declaration of the universal rights of man, is the sense that somehow this is seen as something which is French and it's universal. Yeah? It's going on principles of reason, it's going on principles based also of republicanism, maybe even seen to some extent as a secular principle, but it's impossible to say, well, this is both universal and not French, because it's both at the same time. So it's quite interesting that if you think that through, you get to an interesting stage of nationalism. You might be actually quite patriotic, but at the same time, you can see yourself as believing in these particular, what perceived national characteristics that are also cosmopolitan or universal ones. And this is why the word universal becomes important. André Gide, for example, when you get into the next decade, finds himself using universal, avoiding the word cosmopolitan. There's a very good book about the use of the term cosmopolitanism from Paul Bourget to Marguerite Yourcenar, and shows how a lot of people don't use the term for these reasons, but are engaging, of course, with the same ideas. So that was all I really wanted to say about the French one. Just one final example. The French historian Michel Vinocq has made an interesting distinction between two types of nationalism. There's open nationalism and there's closed nationalism. And I think it's interesting from our point of view to what a sense of open nationalism actually overlaps with the notion of cosmopolitanism. And that's one way, again, of going away from the binary being one or the other. And then final words then is about influence, and then opening it back up to specifically thinking about the Scottish example. What I found thinking about this really for the first time, I know people like Michael have done a lot more of this than I have, is that it's very difficult to think in terms of specific influences with cosmopolitanism for a number of reasons. Now, we all know that Romanticism, again, is something which is very ambiguous. It's different in different contexts. It starts at different times. What's interesting, the French Romanticism, in a way, parts of it are political and parts of it are more aesthetic. And you almost see a kind of split towards the end of Romanticism, towards realism on one side, if you like, and art for art on the other, both coming out of Romanticism. Naturalism is a wonderful example for us. This is why naturalism, where you know where it starts, you know the theories, you can see how it's taken up. Then it becomes interesting when you realize that people were doing similar things anyway without being explicitly influenced by Zola and the other naturalist writers. You can't say that for cosmopolitanism, because once you go to try and reconstitute the history, and I try to do this a little bit in my talk, you think, well, people talk about Rousseau and Voltaire. Rousseau himself is set up by Madame de Staël as a great example of the cosmopolitan, but Rousseau is very ambivalent himself in a very modern way. He uses the term cosmopolite positively in certain contexts, but he's very suspicious of an idea that people proclaim themselves to be cosmopolitan, but they don't put these ideas into practice. It's a sense of just saying, well, I'm entrenching my, what you might call now, liberal credentials. So I think when we think about models, and I'm talking particularly about the French model, but perhaps for all models, I don't, as far as I can see, think there's a model of cosmopolitanism which we can say this is the model which becomes the most influential. I think there's lots of different examples which we can learn from, and we can use in different ways, but it's by use of analogy rather than specific influence. But I look forward to be corrected. That's it for me. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm very happy to go back on any of those points and develop them in more detail if needed.
Thank you, Richard. That was wonderfully responsive. Took in so much of the material that we released from presenters already, and then added from your own point as well. So we've now got a bit of time. I was going to do for questions and answers. If anybody who's here as an attendee wants to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of Zoom, and I'll relay it to the panelists. But first, I want to open up to the panelists to respond to Richard with any questions or observations, if anybody has any. Michael, I think, is that you unmuting to ask a question?
I did, yes. Yeah, I'm happy to kick off.
A strange virtual world that we now live in.
Yeah, I know. Just thanks again, Richard. Really, really compelling, and it's nice to see you sort of summarising all the different strands from the different talks that have been released, but then also from Stefano's introduction earlier. I suppose I'm really fascinated by this idea of different cultures, and particularly in France, this idea of trying to co-opt cosmopolitanism almost for a nationalist cause in a way, to make the case that we are the most cosmopolitan, we are the most open. And I'm interested in it, particularly in a Scottish context, because we do get a bit of that with people like Patrick Geddes, for instance, who is continually showing how Scotland is more receptive to the world and tries to position Scotland more in the world, and often directly comparing Scotland to England on that front. And it's not just Geddes, you can see elements of it in people like John Buchan and Stevenson as well. So yeah, I think it's just a really useful idea to be putting forward for us. But I'm interested in, who are these French figures? Could you give us a few names of people who are trying to kind of claim cosmopolitanism as a distinctively French or a particularly French phenomenon?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and there's two answers to that. The first thing is, a lot of these people are beyond these particular debates about French fin de siècle literary scene, have pretty much been forgotten, because essentially they are critics and journalists who are very important at the time, particularly around the journal La Revue du Monde, but other journals as well. That's the first answer. That I can come back and talk a little bit about some of those examples in a moment. But the second part of your question, I think, is particularly interesting in terms of who it is actually claiming it as something is specifically French. And I don't think from the evidence that I've seen that anyone is actually explicit in that assumption. It is something which is actually implied in the idea of how the term is going to be used. And this is why, in sense, some of the critics get into problems, because by effectively saying, well, we already have these things in French literature, and this is part of what you see in the backlash of the 1890s. Why do we need to look to Russia, to Scandinavia, to England, elsewhere for this? Because we already have this wonderful literary tradition. So that particular conservative point of view is effectively saying we don't really need literary cosmopolitanism, because we already have our own national literary tradition. And there's a certain sort of elitism, you might say a certain type of snobbery, but it's a sense, of course, that this tradition is more developed, it's been more influential, and it's linked particularly to the neoclassical view of literature, and a certain view looking back, particularly before the revolution, thinking back to the idea of literature which had blossomed. So going back as far as the 17th century, in fact, I think, well, we already have this great view of literature. We can go back to these particular ideas. But this is exactly what people are arguing about. So when you have someone like Jules Lemaitre, who is saying, well, actually, we don't need to look for these types of things, immediately someone like Ferdinand Brunetière, who, to many senses, again, is quite a conservative writer. A lot of these writers are conservative writing for this journal, but there's two types of conservatives arguing for, well, no, actually, that's not true. And then it becomes more interesting. It's saying, well, actually, by taking from others, we are enriching our own tradition. So not only are we able to be open, we've already given this tradition, and then we're accepting things for more. So it's not simply a sense of being open in a sense of being wanting to learn. It's also how that comes back into enriching the domestic tradition. So those are those particular arguments which are going on. But I haven't seen any evidence of anyone specifically saying, well, cosmopolitanism in itself is an actual French invention or it's a French team. It's something which is implied once people start trying to work through these particular ideas, because they realize they're effectively talking about notions which come from a French tradition. Does that answer the question, okay?
Yeah, that's a really useful distinction actually between that kind of implied inherent worldliness or not needing these kind of outside sources versus explicit attempts to align cosmopolitanism with a particular culture. Great.
Jerry, were you looking to come in there? Or?
Matthew, were you saying to me?
Yes, were you?
Sorry, I was just going to, an observation which might be a lazy stereotype or not, I can be corrected on this, but in many ways it seems to me that France owns culture from the medieval period down to the 19th century, from Romance modes through neoclassicism and on. So they never need to be explicit about the fact that they have invented Western culture almost to stretch a point. And I wonder if that's why it's invisible or non-existent, the explicit French idea that we're the people doing cosmopolitanism.
No, that's a very good point, Jerry. In fact, there is a, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but there's a book from the 1820s. Benedict might know this one. Sigismond, I think, is one of these writers with many surnames. But there is a history of literature which doesn't actually talk about French literature, because it's an assumption that everybody knows about it. So talk about the literature from other parts of the world. Also, what's interesting in this context, it's not simply a political and historical factor or factors which are at play, but it's also to do with the notion of Latin. It's also to do with the way that the Renaissance is inherited when it comes from Italy into France, the sense that the French take up the baton. So effectively, the French have become representative of a Latin tradition. But what's very interesting for our argument is how that's challenged. So this is why Madame de Stael, I think, is particularly interesting, because she is able to open up. She accepts the value of French literature, but she says what's particularly interesting is what we can learn from other ones. And her division, which I spoke about in my little film, is between Southern and Northern, two words which I always find difficult saying, but I'll have a go at them. Septentrional, there we go, and meridional, words I don't use very often. But those are the two ones. They obviously sound a lot better in French than they do in my mouth in English. And that's her specific division. And again, in a way, it's seems a bit of a clumsy way of thinking about it, because it's so essentialized. It's saying, well, we have, this is the Latin or the French tradition, the Southern tradition. This is the Northern tradition, including Britain. Rousseau, who happens to be Swiss, the advantage of that, he's able to combine both of those particular elements. But having said, and with all those caveats about the problems of this generalized, essentialized view of literature, it does open up the notion of French. It's not arguing that the French literature has its own hegemony. It's saying, well, actually, we can learn from other things. We can look and we can bring these particular traditions together. And of course, she in her own, in her own behavior, in her own actions, as we all know, was particularly interested in going beyond, talking to writers, traveling, particularly writers from the Germanic tradition, and eventually having to leave France and then settle in Coppet. So in a sense, she ends up, to some extent, almost taking up Rousseau's banner, if you like, and saying, well, actually, we can take up this particular banner. So I think from that point of view, there is an alternative sense going on. And this is quite a few of the people I've mentioned in my talk have made this particularly clear. They said it's too simplistic simply to say that the Enlightenment is, as Stefano was saying, Enlightenment is one of the flowerings of the notion of cosmopolitanism. It is, not just from Kant, but also specifically from people like Voltaire as well. Once you get into the 19th century, yes, we know the 19th century sees this interest in different forms of nationalism. We know, of course, in terms of the imperial expansion. But all that means is cosmopolitanism just mutates. It doesn't go away. So people like Gilles Tihanov and other critics have written very interestingly about how we can still trace cosmopolitanism right through the 19th century. And I dare say you could probably do that pretty much for all of literary history if you wanted to. You could see elements of the cosmopolitan view just changing, taking on different names, taking on different guises, but according to the particular context.
We've got a question from Francis Fowle in the audience, who asks, is it true to say that cosmopolitanism was not just associated with France, but with Paris? She says, having said that, was the focus on the provincial, i.e. Breton and Provençal culture, a strangely inverted form of cosmopolitanism at the fin de siècle?
Yes. Well, yes, again, I mean, it's an interesting question. From my knowledge, most of my...
Are we all dancing around Pascal Casanova here? Is that, I mean,
yeah.
because that's the, I mean, that seems to be the kind of...
Yes,
idea. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, I think, I mean, that's a very interesting question about the French provincial, or the French regional examples. And it's one, you know, I don't know an enormous amount about. Most of the examples I've taken have been exactly from this, very much this Parisian argument. This is where the arguments are going on. This is where the journals are being published. But some of the things I've read have made some interesting, given some interesting examples about this. And it's also linked back to what we were talking about, different models, different networks. So for example, some of the symbolist periodicals that you find in Belgium were bypassing Paris and were making links with Provençal journals, but also in Brittany as well. So you do see these elements of a regional form of cosmopolitanism going on, bypassing Paris. And again, the center suddenly being seen as too powerful, but also slightly static and something which is a bit rarefied. And you know, there's interesting things going on in different areas. Benedict might like to pick that up with the connection between Montpellier and Scotland as well. But the other part of Francis's question, which is whether there's some kind of inverse form of anti-cosmopolitanism. Well, again, that's a very interesting one, and it's one that I can't sincerely answer with any particular examples about whether you can go, well, people are moving away. I think they're moving away against perhaps to something which is seen as, what's the word I'm looking for, dominant in the sense of the use of the capital, and that's the imposition of the view. So this goes back to the very point of definitions. Once cosmopolitan becomes synonymous with fashionable or powerful, or once it becomes synonymous with urban, it's very easy to just see it in those negative terms and set yourself up against it and conveniently ignore the parts of cosmopolitanism which apply to everybody irrespective of where they're living. But I'd have to find some more evidence, I'm afraid, to really answer that question properly.
Well, I think having raised this question of centres and peripheries, those are kind of important terms that I think are highly debated in relation to Scotland's position within Britain and Europe. And I wonder if this is a good point at which to move on to thank Richard very much for, and we'll come back to some of those points, I think, in the general discussion, and move on to Jerry, if that's okay. Is that all right? We hand on to Jerry for his sort of 5-minute precis. Okay, are you okay to go, Jerry?
Yes, thank you, Matthew.
Sorry, I should introduce you first, shouldn't I? I should say, it's hard to believe that anybody doesn't know who Jerry is. Jerry Carruthers is the Francis Hutcheson Chair of Scottish Literature. I mean, it's tempting somebody to think that Jerry is Scottish literature. His interests and his activities are so varied, so intense. He's one of the general editors of the ongoing edition of the works of Robert Burns. He's the co-director of the Centre for Robert Burns Studies here at Glasgow, but he's also done work on Walter Scott, on Muriel Spark. He's involved in the People's Voice Project on 19th century Scottish political poetry. I mean, his interests are various and wide. So I'll stop talking and I'll hand over to Jerry. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Matthew. That's very kind of you. And in fact, you've set me up nicely to intrude my bit of nervousness, which was thankfully dispelled by seeing the contributions of Benedict, Richard and Alex, because thank God, as an 18th century scholar, some of my 19th century observations certainly chimed with what I was hearing in these other presentations. I suppose I'm particularly interested in, if you like, the problem of cosmopolitanism and the Victorian period, obviously enough in the Scottish context, but specifically because at the moment I'm editing the Blackwell Companion to Scottish Literature, which will appear in 2023. And in my introduction, and indeed trying to edit the contributions and to sort out the narrative lines, one of the big problems that I have to deal with is the problem of Celtic revival, however that is defined. And it seems fairly obvious to me when you look at people like Patrick Geddes and the Evergreen Project that Celtic revival involves cosmopolitan energy and is also part of a very contemporary mainstream intellectual project in some ways, which slightly paradoxically perhaps argues about moving or suggests that we ought to move to the peripheries to bring in other cultural elements. And of course, that's the ongoing post-romantic project of seeking out the primitive, or the other, or however you want to define it. Geddes and other Celticists clearly sit within a sort of mainstream European philology found in Germany, Denmark, lots of places. We could anchor this by thinking about the rise of Celtic departments, for instance, at Oxford in 1876, similar movements in Dublin, Glasgow, elsewhere, down into the 20th century. And indeed, that Celticism can be traced back at least to 1804 in France, for example, which is kind of intriguing. So there's something very contemporary about Celticism philology. And of course, it's no accident that Matthew Arnold is one of the great champions of Celticism of Renan in the UK, and that he is also one of the architects in the classical argument of the new discipline of English literature. So there are all kinds of things about national canon formation and ethnic cultural currents that are flowing through the late 19th century fairly obviously. And one of those is pan-Celticism, which even as it is a kind of confederated ethnic idea, is partly, I think, about moving away from both Franco and Anglo-Saxon ideas of the nation and of culture. Often, as I say, regional in some sense. And these different formations and deformations of large cultural blocks of nation, of internationalism, it's no great surprise. This is class 101 in structuralism. We've got formation and deformation going on at the same time. And that, I think, explains to a large extent how we need to look at cosmopolitanism as it's forming and as it's breaking down at the same time. Now, the Scottish context has perplexed me for years, not just about cosmopolitanism, but that's certainly part of it. And this is a narrative we find in the 19th century populist Presbyterian versions of this, but it's really the 20th century where we get high modernist cultural nationalist versions that insert this problem. Let me give you a few examples very quickly. This is part of the reason that Scottish literary criticism, Scottish cultural criticism, will often mishandle its own history, if I want to be a wee bit provocative. So, for instance, the Treaty of Arbroath, a letter from the Scottish nobility in Latin to the Pope, to the centre of civilization, is reinterpreted sometimes as a much more populist, less cosmopolitan, less international document. The notorious, disgraceful handling in Scotland of the Enlightenment, where it's seen as alien, it's seen as too cosmopolitan, it's seen as non-native. And although the Scottish Enlightenment is inflected very heavily by French influence, what tends to happen especially is that those who want to attack the Enlightenment historically, it becomes code for a form of anti-Englishness. In the process, they're kicking out, as they attack the supposedly Anglo-centric Scottish Enlightenment, all kinds of much wider neoclassical cosmopolitan elements. And this mistrust of the cosmopolitan, which they don't explicitly realise is the mistrust of the cosmopolitan, happens repeatedly in 20th century Scottish criticism, so that we go back and we reread our most cosmopolitan figures. For instance, James Boswell, who knocks about London, so that's not good, he's a jock on the make, or Thomas Carlyle, and his writings, for instance, about the French Revolution, or Sartor Resartus, one of our big contributors to canonical European culture, is seen as not Scottish enough. And this continues down to the present day, so that we have the awkward reception of people like Muriel Spark, who's seen as not completely Scottish. And to riff on a point that Richard was making, her Jewishness doesn't help. Because so often, for me, the villain in this is Hugh MacDiarmid, the high priest of Scottish modernism, who, although he praises Patrick Geddes within limits, in many ways disavows Scottish Celticism and the Celtic revival, even while at the same time assuming a Celticized pseudonym. Christopher Murray Grave becomes Hugh MacDiarmid. And if we take this at least down to the 1960s, we get that disgraceful moment where Hugh McDermott rounds in Alexander Trocchi. Okay, the man had pimped his wife, he was a pornographer, he was a drug addict, there was lots of things not to admire about Trocchi, but Hugh McDermott in the early 60s says to Alexander Trocchi, "You, sir, are cosmopolitan scum." And that is him echoing his long-standing Soviet allegiance, which carried within it that casual anti-Semitism, where, as Richard has mentioned, cosmopolitanism is code for a Jewish person. So that is the ongoing problem of how to calibrate nation and further nationness of cosmopolitanism in Scottish literature. And it's an ongoing problem, and I cannot believe that we still are having trouble with this narrative in the early 21st century. But in Scotland we are, and we should be very careful, because all kinds of smug things going on about how we're supposedly in Scotland more democratic, have somehow a greater sense of civic responsibility, say, than the English. And we're in danger still in the 21st century of generating too many anti-cosmopolitan narratives in our culture. And I'll leave that there just now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. That was wonderful, and followed very, very nicely on from some of the things we were just talking about. I want to open up to questions and answers now for 10-15 minutes. And first give the other panelists a chance to respond or to follow up. Alex, I think, yeah, you.
Hi, Jerry. So just, yeah, first of all, just to say thank you for your video and your contribution. And as you know, I think very much along the same lines about the difficulties that the dominance of the national frame imposes onto the study and the analysis of Scottish literature. And I think it's something it's almost impossible for us to throw off. So this is a kind of comment / question coming from a place of kind of profound sympathy with the lines of your project, of what you're suggesting here. But I'm wondering whether some of the points which have come up about already today, and I think particularly in Stefano's talk, and Richard's already touched on them, about the tensions and the conflictual texture of cosmopolitanism, I want to kind of just reflect that back at you, and with two examples. So one is thinking about the fin de siècle Celticism and thinking about the way that Stevenson, for example, undoubtedly has he is a unionist and a Tory in politics. He is intensely invested in his Scottish national identity, which he understands as a kind of itself conflictual. But he's also profoundly invested in his own, in trying to trace his own personal racial genetic inheritance as Celtic. And that aligns in awkward ways with his, you know, as you say, it associates him with a kind of cosmopolitan pan-Celticism, but also with a kind of profound ethnic rootedness. And I think he sees that, as you say, in Arnoldian terms, as a way of thinking about his figure, himself as an aesthetician and as sort of more stylish than the rest of Scotland. And I think that's a trend that actually ties him in some ways to MacDiarmid and MacDiarmid's position, which is that it is also a kind of an aesthetic counter-politics, which seeks to overturn a kind of commercial bourgeois Scotland, which in his terms is anglicised. And I think that definitely explains the Celtic figuration in some of MacDiarmid's self-presentation. And your point is absolutely taken about the situation with Trocchi. But you also see there, and I'm thinking of In Memoriam James Joyce as an attempt to write an explicitly world literary epic. So we're definitely introducing here something which we could say is a kind of internationalism or a world literature as opposed to a true cosmopolitanism. But even within In Memoriam James Joyce, what he's trying to do is explore the difference between a kind of an abstract universalism, a sort of homogenizing imperialism of the English kind of like world language, and then a truly kind of mosaic cosmopolitanism of different national, regional, and territorial things. And depending on how you read that poem, he seems to go back and forth as to whether this is possible or achievable. So long-winded, again, more of a comment than a question, I'm afraid. Yeah. But I'm wondering whether the framework of this discussion actually gives us a way to access the debates anew by thinking about the interlocking at different levels of the national and the cosmopolitan or the universal within these different stylistic projects.
Yes, I think I would agree more or less with all of that, Alex. And I don't necessarily have any issues with the aesthetic practice of any of these writers, including McDermott. My issue is with the calling card of McDermott, who is explicit about his practice and about Scottish literary history in wrong ways. I think the problem comes back to Scotland being obsessed with a kind of T.S. Eliot version of tradition, you know, almost, as I say, down to the present day, when other people, if I want to be harsh about it, other nations have sort of parked that earlier. Because actually what we've got, which you've alluded to, time and again, we have things that don't add up in Stevenson or McDermott or Geddes or whoever, and there's nothing wrong with that, because they're trying to make sense of the structural nationalism that's all around them, and which they need to engage with to some extent politically, whether you're a Marxist or a Leninist like McDermott, whether, as you say, you're a Tory like Stevenson. So there was a kind of necessary politicisation of literary consciousness, but too often the things don't align, and too often the structural nationalism through which Scottish literature is described actually mangles and under-describes cosmopolitan and international energies that are certainly there, including in McDermott. But our critics then go on and they kind of over-discriminate between the native and the non-native. Everything is much baggier, much messier, and that's the way it is not only with literature, but with cultural evolution or cultural development. And I think we need to reach a situation where we're not securely holding, or actually insecurely holding on to the idea of native traditions. Native traditions exist, but they attach onto other things, and nothing is as self-contained as might be thought. So I think you're right. We need to find new structural ways of setting out narratives that don't say Muriel Spark doesn't really write about Scotland all that much, therefore she's not Scottish, which is what, you know, Robin Jenkins, very much McDermott follower, says at one point. So we've had over-discrimination. The good thing is that cosmopolitanism is there in spades throughout Scottish literary history, as elsewhere, and we just need to realise, you know, that you know, again, it's that rereading of medieval Scottish literature sometimes, but not always, that tries to write out the French Romance elements. You know, because, oh, there's something more native going on. Let's have both these things. Let's be relaxed. Let's be chilled out about it all.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any questions from the floor at the moment. I'm wondering. So I've got a kind of general question around the term cosmopolitanism. And around, I mean, this anticipates, I think, something that will come up in relation to what Alex has to say, which is to say that I wonder if there's a distinction between the fact of cosmopolitanism and the theory of cosmopolitanism. In other words, what I think you're describing there, Jerry, is you're saying, well, Scotland has always had links with other parts of the world. And this is something that will come up, for example, in Linda Hughes' presentation when she's talking about Andrew Lang, and she's got that example from Longman's magazine where Lang is doing his kind of usual column, and he talks about Scottish things, but he also makes passing reference to other bits of the world, other cultures, other languages, including French, Latin, and German, I think. So there's the kind of the fact of interconnectedness. And this is something that's important in the Ingrams as well, you know, which talks about the kind of, you know, one of the reasons why cosmopolitanism has that moment in theory in the 1990s is because people are confronting globalization, the fact of interconnection, of economic interconnection, the fact, as we're looking at now, talking to people across the UK and I think other parts of the world, if the email addresses are anything to go by, you know, the fact of technological interconnection now as well. There are these interconnections. There have been interconnections, you know, thinking about Stevenson, thinking about, you know, the South Sea stories, but also the French presence in something like Kidnapped as well. You know, there are kind of interconnections all the way through. So they're there, but what seems contentious about cosmopolitanism is what sort of disposition you adopt towards those interconnections that are just kind of, you know, that are part of the way the world works. You know, the fact that, you know, languages, you know, change and evolve as people move in and out of areas in various different ways. You know, but as I say, it's the question of the disposition. Cosmopolitanism is a disposition towards the fact of kind of interconnection, and that's where it becomes problematic. We feel that the pull of particular attitudes towards your local area, or your nation state, or whatever it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does, Matthew. And what it reminds me of is, if I want to push this a wee bit, although I would have to add all kinds of caveats, in the later 19th century, when Scotland is beginning to engage quite explicitly in certain cosmopolitan debates about Celticism and others, it's in a sort of insecure position, because although there's a home rule movement, it's in a very different status to what you get in Ireland. So the fact of Scotland's apparent statelessness, if we can call it that, at the same time when everyone is saying, let's not worry about the state, and at a point at which I suppose the Victorian superstate is breaking up, and some people in Scotland are looking for something alternative, it's very fragile ground that we've got in some ways in Scottish culture. And Stevenson writes a bit about this, and you know, what we get are quite sort of easy, interesting, sometimes facile narratives about why Stevenson goes to the south of England and then to the South Seas. You know, that's taken as symptomatic of the statelessness of Scotland, the dilettanteism writ large in all kinds of bad ways. If only we had a proper state like England or even Ireland, everything would be more rooted. I think there's all kinds of false equations being made there, but there are particular Scottish insecurities about politics and aesthetics that come together in various ways.
We've got a question from the Q. Oh, Richard, we'll hear from Richard, and then we've got a question from Q&A, and then we'll move on to Benedict. But Richard, what was your point that you wanted to make?
It's just a very quick one coming in on what Jerry was just talking about, listening to that. And I was also thinking about the problems of terminology, nomenclature, even as of epistemology, what we mean by notions of Scottish literature, what we mean by English literature. I was thinking about the fact that in some publishers' detail, you see Samuel Beckett down as English literature, and you start thinking about what that really means. But it's in terms of how we do it, and we all know the problems about defining them, but it's interesting thinking about them in these particular contexts. But the other point was just Jerry's answer to that question, thinking about Stevenson moving and setting up these questions about what it actually meant to go away. It's interesting if you're comparing that with other cultures, and I was reminded of one of the articles that Stefan and I edited in that journal issue on fin de siècle cosmopolitanism. It was by a colleague in Norway, Katrin Theodorsen. And one of her points was that Norway had an almost active national model of cosmopolitanism, in which it gave travel scholarships to writers to go away. So effectively, it's like a fin de siècle version of the Grand Tour, if you like. Here's some money, go and live either in Paris or Rome. I'm not sure if Ibsen himself had one of these scholarships, but obviously enjoyed traveling. And then you come back, but you will enrich the national tradition as a result of doing this. So it's almost like a state-sanctioned version of what we were talking about earlier on in a French example. But it doesn't, as far as I can see, seem to be problematic until you start thinking about internal debates. And what this article was interesting was talking about the types of writers who didn't get these scholarships. And these are often because they don't actually adhere to what the notion of a representative writer would be. We just imagine how problematic that would be now if we were to give those types of scholarships to people. And I'm sure the British Council, for example, would be something they must have thought about. Where does money go to? What are we funding? What are our priorities? So a writer such as Sigbjørn Obsfelder, fairly forgotten now, but an interesting writer, big influence on Rilke, was the type of writer who wasn't given the scholarships because of his proto-modernist text, which didn't seem to be really engaging with notions of what it was to be Norwegian. So simply to say that might be, again, one of the possible models of thinking about Scottish cosmopolitanism, how it compares to other examples. But of course, there is always a language question as well, isn't it? Where you have if you have a country which has its own linguistic tradition, in a sense, it's separate. So there's a disadvantage depending on what type of language you're writing, which of course has pros and cons. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think linguistic essentialism is also part of the problem in Scotland, because we get this notion arising really from the late 19th century and through to McDermott that really the Scots language is the true language, of Scotland, and anything in English, you know, is alien. So that's a whole other part of the argument that's very problematic.
We've got a couple of other questions in Q&A, but I'm going to put them to one side for the moment because I want to move on to Benedict, and I think we'll come back to the questions that are in Q&A because they're there for us to follow up on as when we've got time later on. And so I do want to get to move on to Benedict now. If you're ready, Benedict. So Benedict Costa, very pleased to introduce, is from the University of Burgundy. She's done a considerable amount of work on Pater and has, I think, at least one, if not two books on the go about Pater, including Pater et les philosophes. But she's also the editor of a connection of thinking about kind of Jerry's point about modernism and Scottish modernism. She's also one of the editors of a collection called Reconnecting Aestheticism and Modernism. So the connections between the 19th and 20th century are part of Benedict's interests as well. She's working as well at the moment on a database, an online database of French translations from English writers in French periodicals called Decabase, which is really fascinating and important work. But I'm going to stop talking now and hand over to Benedict. Benedict, would you like me to show any slides? Is that what?
Yeah, if you could, that would be great. Could you just, because I'm just going to say in a few words that I already recorded, but there's a slide which is quite interesting, and that's the one which features a map of the garden of that Geddes created in Montpellier.
Is it this one here? The college?
Not that one. So it's the it's number.
This one here.
Yeah. Yes, that's number 12.
There we go.
Right. Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Matthew and Michael, for inviting me and for allowing me to discuss Geddes. Because I had a long-standing interest in Patrick Geddes, but what I listened to, what I read also quite recently, including the documents that were circulated, also fed my reflections. Right. I would like to say that I'm interested in translation and working on Patrick Geddes's Collège des Écossais, the Scots College that's created in Montpellier, which is where I live, also allowed me to still work on translation, because I conceive of the college as a stone translation. I conceive of the gardens that surround the college as also some kind of material translation of Geddes's ideas, conceptions, visions and symbolism. And in fact, I also see that very international, and I'm using the word on purpose, international college also as as in continuity with his previous achievements, which have somehow detailed in my talk. So when I started to work on the college, what I didn't realize was that in fact the college was not the whole picture of Geddes's achievements in Montpellier. He had also bought some kind of decaying folly in the neighboring village of Assas, and he had bought that decayed building, which he started somehow to repair. But he had also a whole scheme of complete reforestation and regeneration of the whole village of Assas. Of course, couldn't do that. Neither could he achieve his idea of regeneration of Les Brusses, which was the area where the college stood. But still, I really see that college, both in continuity with his former achievements, but also as a translation, and also I would add as as in continuity with his own work at the Evergreen. I won't discuss the evergreen because I guess, and I know that some, well, research has been and is still being completed on the evergreen. My approach to the evergreen is just some very empirical approach. That is to say, I'm interested in its material presentation, its appearance, and its contents, but also the visual content. And I see and I approach the evergreen also as well, some cosmopolitan magazine, slightly different, as I said, from the cosmopolitanism of some well-known magazines such as the Yellow Book or Cosmopolis, because the cosmopolitanism that is deployed in the evergreen is what I, well, intuitively called some kind of regional cosmopolitanism. That is to say, cosmopolitanism that relies not so much on states, nations, politics, but much more on regions, and most especially on, well, at the time, of course, and in the context of the growing fin de siècle nationalisms, which relies on marginalized regions that were not usually considered or discussed. And so there's, of course, there's Scotland, there's Belgium, and what Richard said about the relationship between France and Belgium is highly relevant, because France, well, used or would consider that it embodied cosmopolitanism, and that other French-speaking nations or places were less entitled to discuss that. I'm thinking also about the breadth and content of the evergreen, which also deploys that kind of regional cosmopolitanism that goes along also with a particular symbolism that accompanied Geddes, that Geddes developed. He was not the only one, and he relied on the Scottish visual artists that, whose work was featured in the evergreen. But Geddes would take that symbolism with him and translate or import. That's another word, that's another verb that there is also of importance here. He would transport and import that symbolism on the walls of the college, but also in the gardens of the college, which was also meant to function as, you know, some embodiment of cosmopolitanism. And if we think about the project of the college as a project, it was meant to accommodate the students from different nations, but I would say students from different regions. It was also meant to function within, as I said before, a larger project. And Geddes even had, one of his far-fetched schemes meant to create some kind of Mediterranean city and some Mediterranean university that would have had for its center Montpellier, but which would have been into connection with Arles, Tarascon, Nîmes, Narbonne. That is to say, a lot of southern cities, because according to Geddes, the geographical political entity that was France was to be divided into two. That is to say, there would be some kind of center in Paris, but the second center would be in Montpellier and in the southern area. So this is also something which might help us to understand the kind of regional vision that he had and the kind of regional cosmopolitanism that he developed. And once again, it is at the intersection of, you know, both aesthetics and politics. It relies on tensions between peripheries and centers, between marginalized places and metropolises. And but also it also relies on tensions, productive tensions, I would say, between, for instance, Scotland and France, because this was also something that, that alliance, but also that tension between Scotland and France was something that accompanied Geddes. And don't forget that the Scots College was meant to replace a former Scots College that stood in Paris at the close of the Middle Ages. So we do have also that tension, which in fact gives and I'm going to use a word that has been used since the beginning of the webinar, that would have given texture to cosmopolitanism as Geddes sees it. So I'm just going to say a few words just about the garden, and you can see, yes, the garden, and that's a drawing which appears in one of the latest French publications on Geddes, and that's a drawing of the gardens as they would have been. They are no longer extant. Most of those gardens have been transformed into buildings and into parking lots. The only interesting features is the creation of the School of Architecture, which was conceived of by one of the later residents at the college, André Schimmerling, who came from Hungary and who worked at the college after Geddes' death, and who acted as a translator and as a lawyer, and who came back in Montpellier in the 60s and who created the School of Architecture. And what's very interesting about the School of Architecture, which stands in fact also on the grounds of the college and near those buildings, is that school was also devised according and constructed according to Geddesian principles. That is to say, it mixes and it connects larger and smaller spaces and makes for circulation within the school and between the school and the outside of the school. And that's something which also derives from Geddes. Now, to go back to cosmopolitanism, I would say, and I was very happy and very, I was more than happy. It was a pleasing, a stimulating experience to read Alex's material when James Ingram discusses embodied cosmopolitanism and discusses the need to start not from theory, but from experience and from fact and from the lived experience of people to devise the theory. And I would contend that this is precisely what Geddes did, creating magazines, creating the Outlook Tower, creating buildings, creating college, creating envisaging to create that Mediterranean university city, and then trying to theorize after those achievements. And that's something which I would say is also an important dimension of what I would like to call is embodied cosmopolitanism. That's something which needs to be said. And I also want just to add that this cosmopolitanism is also translated cosmopolitanism. It's material. It's also physical cosmopolitanism. And here I use physical from the Greek word physis, meaning the earth. So it's, but not only the earth, but, the earth as it is being inhabited, as it gives rise to a lived experience. So I would like to conclude that, yes, with Geddes, we do have some kind of very specific cosmopolitanism whose Scottish roots need to be, further examined and, historicized And I agree with Gary, and contextualized, and that's it. Well, thanks.
I'm going to stop sharing the screen there.
Yeah,
just to say thank you very much. That was wonderful. There's a sort of a pathos in hearing from you about, you know, embodied cosmopolitanism, and those lovely links that you were making between the design of the garden and then the design of the evergreen as a publication, and the way that kind of image and text and design work with each other. Just something I'm familiar with, you know, from other work. I think you mentioned the Yellow Book in your talk. I mean, from the there's a sort of pathos in hearing that and thinking about embodied cosmopolitanism, and then hearing that those lovely gardens are now car parks that sort of, you know, they're victims to the Joni Mitchell syndrome. But do people have questions or follow-on points from the panel that they'd like to pass on to? Richard.
In fact, I'm a bit slow because it's a question inspired by Benedict, but it's going probably to Jerry or maybe to Michael or to anybody. But I was just thinking about this example. You were talking about the garden and the evergreen. I'm wondering, and I might have missed this, about possible equivalents in Scotland, not in terms of a garden, but were there particular loci of intercultural discourse going on? I spoke obviously about Madame de Stael in Switzerland. We spoke about Brussels. Were there people coming to Scotland and setting up these things? I mean, in my limited knowledge, I associate that more with the Enlightenment. But do you find that in the late 19th century as well?
Sorry.
Well, it's more really, I think, to be honest, Benedict, it's more probably, it was inspired by you, but I'm not sure if you know very much about the Scottish side. It was more seeing if Jerry and Michael knew about particular.
I'm not that versed into Scottish, and I already mentioned that I'm hugely indebted to Michael Shaw's monograph, but also to Murdo MacDonald's monograph about the intellectual origins of Patrick Geddes'. Mm.
There's one place where you can see this quite clearly, and it's the activities around the Marquis of Bute, who of course is seen rightly as someone, an apostle of the new neo-medievalism. And if you look at some of the people he's working with architecturally and in other ways, transacting with and even bringing into the country, there is very much a conscious European cosmopolitanism. Not that he necessarily would have described it in those terms. And again, there is linkage, I think, with Geddes. There's quite a similar mentality, refinding Europe for all kinds of reasons.
Mm-hmm. Michael, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, it's going to be hard to shut me up on this one, to be honest. Yeah, just in terms of equivalences and, you know, the comparisons that are being drawn between Scotland and other loci across the planet. I mean, we can literally go on for hours at this time. Geddes is one figure who's doing this, but he's not the only figure. I'm thinking particularly of William Sharp. One of the connections I've done a lot of work on is with Belgium. I've actually already mentioned the Belgian symbolists, Maurice Maeterlinck, George Eekhout. And yeah, Sharp's real interest in drawing that comparison between Scotland and Belgium in the sense of their position of being next to a very large neighbour, France and England, but then still trying to assert their own cultural presence as these kind of sort of peripheral Western nations in their own ways. And he does a lot of work translating their works, trying to import their works into Scotland. I think there's a lot to be said about India in these contexts as well. With Geddes, I mentioned earlier the Bengali Renaissance that kind of brought about this friendship between him and Rabindranath Tagore. Geddes also does very weird things in the Middle East when he's there, of course, as part of setting up the Hebrew University, where he draws comparisons between Scotland and Jewish people there, and then also with Palestinians, kind of both on a similar line of dispossession. And of course, there's huge problems with all these kind of equivalences that are being built. But nevertheless, it does speak to this kind of the comparisons that are being built, and Scotland sort of thinking about itself through an international lens. How does it compare to these other nations? You see, it's all with Stevenson when he goes to the South Seas. He's seeing everything through the lens of Scotland and building comparisons through it. There's that wonderful line where he compares native Samoans, and he says that they are the closest living example of what we have to the Highlanders before the 45. So it's just, you know, this attempt to sort of see Scotland in the world. And in terms of actually material collaborations, I think looking at Geddes' summer schools, where he's trying to bring people from all across the planet together in those summer schools in Edinburgh, that's a very good example of trying to build these energies. And it goes to a question that I have for Benedict, and that is, so Geddes has all these different universities and schools that he's part of. So we've got, obviously in India, we've got the Hebrew University, his work at Edinburgh University, also Dundee, and then of course Montpellier as well. He does some work with the Sorbonne in France. Were they the main, basically asking, what was the kind of cohort, what was the student body of the Scots College? Were they drawn from all these little satellites that Geddes had established, or was it more broad than that?
No, well, as far as I know, they are, well, students would come from England, they would come from Scotland. You know, in Andrew Years and Geddes' books, you've got some testimonies that have been translated into French, so they should be available in English. And you find, well, young Scotsmen, but also women, yes. There's also, I would say that there are still some work to do on women attending the college and living in the college. You know, the college, in fact, didn't deliver any specific teaching. Students would go and enroll at the universities of Montpellier, but it would accommodate and it would also train and provide, you know, some very specific Geddesian environments. So it would also, sorry. American students, well, from the United States. Of course, there was also, and that's something I didn't mention in my talk, the Collège des Indiens. That is it was called the Collège des Indiens because India and Indians had paid for it. So they would also be residents.
Oh, so there's a comment in the Q&A. I think it's a comment rather than a question. Two things from Sian Reynolds to pass on. So, and one of the first things I think relates to this, and she points out the influence of the Montpellier College. The visitors book of the Collège des Écossais is in Aberdeen University Library.
I didn't know about that. Thank you so much.
You're going to have to come back to Scotland, Benedict.
Yeah, you know, I wish I was you.
I think we all wish we were together. I mean,
yeah.
Life is what it is. Yes. So the visitors book is in Aberdeen University Library, and apparently the name of the last student in 1939 was Robert Shackleton, who was Sian's supervisor in the 1960s, a Montesquieu specialist. And the subject he suggested was internationalism and patriotism in 18th century France. And Sian also points to, I mentioned your Decabase. There's another database, the BOSLIT, B-O-S-L-I-T database at the NLS of Scottish literature translated into various languages.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much.
There's one more question from Q&A, and then I think we should move on to Alex. And this is a question for Benedict from Fraser Riddell. Who says, I wondered if you could say a little bit more about material environments and embodiment. Are there particular concerns, Fraser asks, with sensory experience that promote cosmopolitan attitudes, such as the Zen garden or the Camera Obscura? And he refers us to Vernon Lee's essay on the Edinburgh Camera Obscura in the Tower of Mirrors. So are there particular, is there anything you could say about the material environment, that embodiment that you talked about?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a great question, and that's something I can see. You know, I'm looking at as I'm talking to you about the question and responses. I would say that the gardens as the drawing tries to show, would have involved visitors and inhabitants into into different sensory experiences. The first thing that comes to mind is that being in the garden would have been a much more quiet experience than it can be nowadays, because nowadays the garden is just, well, what's left of the garden is surrounded by cars and noise. You can see on the slide that, in fact, there's several spaces and with several, types of flora and several types of vegetation that also have entailed, the cultivation of different visual experiences and the sensibility to differences. It also engaged in, I would say, of course, touch, taste. There was a vineyard. That's something which is also quite interesting, and it is part of Geddes' idea of cultivation. It was, it must have been some kind of multi-sensory experience. And, the testimonies that appear in Andrew and Geddes' collection mention the visual dimension and somehow part of the history of the gardens, but they don't mention the global sensory experience, except for one anecdote. And this anecdote is very interesting. There would be some plinth or pedestal awaiting some statues that never arrived. And on those statues, Geddes would entice students to stand and strike a pose. And just to, complete the architecture of the visual setting and the visual architecture of the garden with people, but also enticing students to stop reading books and begin acting like individuals. So that's my answer to that very interesting question. But that's very interesting because it might be, recreated. Just thinking about thinking about that idea, that the whole sensory experience of the gardens.
That sounds like an interesting possible project. Marion Geddes has posted a correction. She says that the Scots Visitors Book is in Edinburgh, not at Aberdeen, I think. But there are a couple more questions still on the Q&A, but I want to move on to Alex Thompson, if we may, and we'll come back to you and answer questions if there's time at the end. If we move on, so Alex Thompson is a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, where he's the head of English. I met Alex longer ago than I care to think about now through the Scottish Network of Modernist Studies, or SNOMS, as we knew ourselves at that point. And his interests are similarly various to some of the other speakers here, in the sense that he's got a very strong background in literary theory, having written on Derrida and Adorno at various points. But he's also somebody who's done work, as I said, on modernism. I've heard Alex talking fascinatingly about Wyndham Lewis, Muir, but he's also involved in the ongoing project to edit Robert Louis Stevenson as well. It's with great pleasure that I'm going to hand over to Alex to talk now, and thank him for being here.
Well, hi everybody, and thank you to Matthew and Michael for organising this, and to everyone else. I'm going to try and keep what I have to say quite brief, and I want to begin by apologising by the fact that everyone else has done presentations and did really interesting talks in advance, and I kind of set homework and sent 40 pages of political theory. Sorry, maybe that was taking us off in the wrong direction. But what I will do to stay brief is, rather than recap what I said in the video about why I think James Ingram's work and this reframing of, which I think the key for me, I guess, is that it reframes what can become a very redundant polarization between the national and the cosmopolitan, which appears to be a choice between two different values, but he reinscribes this as different forms of political intervention and suggests that nationalisms are often cosmopolitanisms, and that cosmopolitanisms are often awfully ethnocentric. And of course, he's drawing on Etienne Balibar, who is writing from the French context. And Balibar in the early 80s worked quite closely with Jacques Derrida on issues around the French state and refugee policies and anti-racism. And I think that's a key impulse for both of them in thinking through their linked, actually, projects on kind of cosmopolitanism as a sort of political position that will allow us to think through what, in a different context, Sailor Ben Habib calls the democratic paradox, which is that egalitarianism in the nation state context is de facto and de jure limited by laws of citizenship, whether those are civic or ethnic. There's a simple limit to how universal a political system can be. And this is work that's actually always spoken to me, and my own interest in Derrida was driven by my original engagement with Scottish literature. And that leads me, if you like, to my reason for bringing this piece into this context. And I think it feeds naturally off the kind of debate which Jerry has quite rightly established, that there's a polemicization and a polarization within the thinking of any Scottish context or any Scottish cultural context between something like a national and a cosmopolitan position. The term cosmopolitanism only really began to be bandied about after devolution. And I'm thinking here of the work of Bertold Schörner and some of his students, Fiona McCulloch or McIntosh, who've kind of like taken that up. And it leads to quite a short and kind of bad-tempered exchange where one group of people are saying, you're all cultural nationalists, you're trying to suborn this liberatory, emancipatory literary project for these kind of like narrow political ends. And the response from the other side is kind of very hostile. Who are you bringing your cosmopolitan values? You're not committing to a nation state building project, which is a kind of pragmatic political priority. I was very surprised to be dragged into this because I've always sought to try and interrogate both sides, but there's at least one very damning piece out there which says, well, you know, the problem with Thompson is he's a British nationalist and he thinks that art should be in English and written by the upper middle classes. And maybe I do, I don't know. But it highlights, I think, the polarization of the field and the difficulty of trying to understand the whole. And I think also the tendency for a kind of mirroring to take place. And you see this very strongly in the discourse of Scottish nationalism around the period of the referendum in 2014 and since then, that all alternatives are framed as other nationalisms. So Britishness, which to be sure has had some of the problems identified with cosmopolitanism in that it can be a silently anglicizing discourse, also in other contexts names a pan-national or a federal ideal, even if in practice that's always betrayed and undermined. And what Ingram helps us keep open, I think, is the possibility that there might be something like strategic cosmopolitanisms, that you might take up British identity as something which is neither English nationalism or Scottish nationalism. And of course, that's going to lead you in the current context to be completely torn apart by both sides, especially if it's a non-unionist British identity. So this is a tremendously overdetermined field. Ingram, I think, is very helpful for thinking that through. But what I want to kind of conclude with is saying something about the difference between aesthetics and politics. Because one of the reasons in the context of a project essentially on aesthetics to turn to a political theorist is that it helps us resist the temptation, and I think it's an incredibly powerful temptation, that the discourse of aesthetics aligns very nicely with the discourse of cosmopolitanism as a kind of touchy-feely, we're the good people kind of idea. And you see this, you know, the idea that, you know, all writers and artists are on the side of good and we all opposed Brexit, for example. You see this coming up again and again in literary criticism, to some extent in kind of like even quite good writing of the contemporary moment, and in journalism as well. And in literary scholarship, I think there has been a reclaiming of cosmopolitanism. I think you see this more in the modernist period, perhaps, than in the late 19th century. So it's interesting talking with scholars of Victorian writing who I think have a slightly more detached and objective view of this. But in modernist studies, which I think still sees itself more strongly as a kind of critical and emancipatory project, cosmopolitanism as a form of transnationalism has been bandied around as a very powerful badge. And what I think the real risk here is that that elides all of the tensions, which I think we've been touching on in all of the writers that we're talking about, and also the tendency to to sort of silently remove the politics from cosmopolitanism in order to repoliticize it again. So just to pick up on a couple of things that we've just said, and then I'll shut up. So some of the things that are coming up in response to Benedict, I have to say, really worried me. And they suggest to me the dangers that we are all prey to when we try and connect cosmopolitanism and aesthetics. So just to pick up Michael's point about Stevenson in the South Seas, Stevenson is a great example of someone whose cosmopolitanism in places is a form of critical detachment. And he absolutely says, unless you travel, unless you've seen more of the world, you will not be able to judge your own cultural context objectively. And absolutely, we can say that this is not a kind of appeal to a pure disinterestedness, but a sort of, in the way that Amanda Anderson describes the Arnoldian project, it's a cultivation of a disposition, the word that Matthew used earlier, and it's a very empiricist approach. I find out two things and then I make a comparison between them, and then that helps them see them both. But inevitably, as Michael says, that leads to him looking at the South Seas and going, fantastic, we're back in the Highlands, or what the Highlands really was in the good old days back before Union. So there's a very complex play of recognition, which is also an ethnocentrism. It's also a form of projection. And the question really is how we get beyond that, rather than simply saying, well, look, Stevenson's one of the good guys because he wasn't one of those bad late 19th century imperialists. He was kind of like open and accepting of other cultures. There's always a risk of those value-laden binaries creeping into the way we react, particularly to artists. And I think we want artists and writers to be the good guys. And I think that's a real problem. And finally, just to say a little bit, coming back to the idea of those cross-national cosmopolitan loci that we were talking about in the late 19th century in Scotland, I think, again, there's a massive temptation here to ignore two factors which upset the way we want to think about this. So one is that all of those literary relationships are brokered through the metropolitan centre in London, with almost no exceptions. And of course, that is dominated by Scots. So when you look at Stevenson and the associational networks that he's involved in, it is an imperial space dominated by, it's a kind of entrepot with Scottish merchants, brokers, agents, publicists, editors at the centre of that kind of print culture. So yes, there are other examples and there are people trying to do different things, but if we focus on those, we risk seeing that there's still this kind of cultural dominance there. And just, I'm looking at Jerry here because David Goldie wrote that wonderful piece for your book on unionism in Scottish literature, where I think he makes that point that there isn't really a Scottish literature at that point. There is a British literary space, which is differentiated, absolutely, but which we risk overlooking. And then I think the other temptation is to downplay the fact that in late 19th century Scotland, the real European links and the real transnational links are being made by scientists and engineers. We want to rewrite the history of Scotland through its art and culture because we've inherited a 20th century distinction between the two cultures. And again, you see this with Stevenson's family firm. You see this with all of the prominent intellectuals and that his family introduced him to, that they are working with European scientists and they are traveling not to study art and literature, but to study engineering and physics and electrics in Germany and elsewhere in the world. So in a way, we have to be very careful that all these different levels of cosmopolitanism don't kind of collapse, and that our interest in aesthetics doesn't sort of draw us away from the whole picture of what's going on. So I guess it's a way of injecting a little skepticism or a kind of like nervousness, kind of maybe it's too much coffee today, a sort of slightly edgy tension into what I think the project can really helpfully do, and why I think it's important and powerful, but also a kind of very tricky territory to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Alex. That was fascinating and I think very powerful as well. I want to say first off that though you talked about setting homework, I think Richard touched on the Ingrams. I certainly found it very useful to read, and I think it, like the discussions that we're having now, I'm really fascinated by what work we have to do to think about Scottish cosmopolitanism at the Fan de Siècle. That's why I deliberately set up this session to call it Debates in Scottish Cosmopolitanism. Scottish cosmopolitanism at the Fan de Siècle, and this initial kind of event was to start thinking about what are the frameworks, what do we need to know, what's out there. So thank you for that, and thank you also. I think one of the things that you're challenging us to do there is to think about what assumptions we make when we approach cosmopolitanism as well. So I find it, I mean, I feel slightly told off, but in a good way, to be thinking about, well, no, because I think you're right. Your point that our assumptions are that we think about, when I think about cosmopolitanism, I think about the arts, and that means not thinking about not being as attentive to the sciences as I should be. So I think it's good always to kind of to confront your own weaknesses and prejudices. So having abased myself, what I want to do now is open it up to comments from other people, and then Q&A from the floor. So does anybody else want to follow on from Alex? So I think Richard first, and then.
Thank you very much for that, Alex. Out of all the recent texts, I say recent in the last 20, 30 years now, that I've read on the subject of cosmopolitanism, one that stuck with me is Derrida's speech, I think it was initially, wasn't it, in Strasbourg, which is translated into English as On Cosmopolitanism, but in French, what translates back as Cosmopolitans of all countries, one more effort. And I'd be interested to know what your take on that particular essay is, in the context of just what you've been saying about avoiding slipping into certain value-laden assumptions about aesthetics, about good views of cosmopolitanism, because Derrida's speech in some way strikes me not necessarily as a manifesto, but certainly as an appeal to put notions of cosmopolitanism into practice through the notions of hospitality, but also specifically what he talks about the cities of sanctuary as well. I'm very interested to know what you think about that particular piece in the light of some of the things that you've been saying.
I mean, I think in some ways you've absolutely hit the nail on the head, that a lot of the last 20 years of Derrida's work was an attempt to kind of continually rethink how the universal, with its problems, can be accessed or fostered, supported through particular ideas. And there's a kind of as we know, a kind of restlessness in his work. It's very context dependent. So sometimes he talks about the New International after the fall of the Berlin Wall in Spectres of Marx. He talks about democracy to come. He talks about justice as the ultimate horizon of deconstruction. He talks about hospitality. He uses cosmopolitanism for a while. And then he begins in his last years to think about sovereignty as a way of reworking it. And one of the things I think is really powerful and interesting in what he's doing is that he doesn't shy away from law and the state. And I think there's a sort of counter-aestheticism there, that universal values can only make sense within institutions. And that, I think, is where, when he writes with Habermas on Europe, when he thinks about the laws of immigration, and he's active. He's actually speaking at events in churches with undocumented migrants and stuff like that. So he really wants to put it into practice. But I wouldn't so I think it's tempting to privilege the cosmopolitanism label, but it flows from the general kind of structure of his thought generally. And I think in some ways, what I see happening with Balabar's work is, and again, it's a gesture of great respect backwards, I think, to Derrida as someone who he really admired both personally and philosophically, that he's trying to kind of cash out from the cosmopolitanism into the cosmopolitical. And although there's less of a kind of Kantian reference, so there's less of that sense of the transcendental gesture, which is made but sort of disavowed or pulled back in Derrida. And he really wants to reinscribe it into material practices. And again, that ties helpfully, I think, to Stefano's approach this morning. I think it ties as well to the point that Benedict was picking up from Ingram about the embodied cosmopolitanism, that it's that this can very rapidly become abstract, but that's ultimately only in multifarious practices in different contexts will be what will move us towards some new form of, something, whatever that happens to be. So it's not a straight answer, but a kind of reframing of your question.
No, thank you.
Did anybody have any want to follow up from that? I'm aware that we've gone over an hour and a half, and I don't want to keep. I know that Jerry has to head off at some point because he's got another appointment somewhere else. So I wonder if we could address a couple of the questions from Q&A, see if there's any other general things, and then sort of wrap things up a bit. So one of the questions that we didn't answer from before on the Q&A was from Alex Murray, who asks what role religion plays in cosmopolitanism and its reception, particularly in a Scottish context. He says, I'm thinking particularly about the suspicion in the 19th century of Roman Catholics having divided sympathies and not being truly English-Scottish. Does that ever feed into anti-cosmopolitanism? And that might be apropos here because we've been talking about the arts and sciences and architecture and engineering, but we haven't mentioned religion yet. So does anybody want to chip in on the role of religion? Jerry, over to you.
Yes, so I'll keep it fairly brief, but it's a very good question, and I think it's a rather under-researched area. If you look at the reception of the Tractarians, the Oxford movement through 19th century Scotland, there is clearly something going on, and that is suspicion of Rome and indeed of Europe. And the starting point here, I would suggest, in fact, is an English novel, if you were to explore this, and that is Benjamin Disraeli's Lothair, which is a kind of satire on the Marquis of Bute, and which implicitly and perhaps even explicitly denigrates all kinds of cosmopolitan European energies, because it's going to allow the whore of Babylon, Roman Catholicism, back in through the back door. But very good question, an area that remains to be explored. I'm absolutely certain there's something in it, and I would suggest Disraeli would be the way into that. Disraeli specifically writing about Scotland, interestingly enough, which tells us a lot about British politics too at this time, and relations with Europe and elsewhere.
Thank you. I think Richard wants to come in on that as well.
Yes, again, this is a very quick answer from the French context. If you look, for example, at Paul Bourget's novel Cosmopolis from 1893, Catholicism plays a very specific role here as an antidote to cosmopolitanism, which I think was part of your question, Alex, about anti-cosmopolitanism. The cosmopolitan characters in this novel are essentially seen as rootless, but also as amoral. And it's the idea that morality is somehow linked to national identity. And the novel is set in Rome. And at the end, when all the various incidents have happened in the text, and people have died, etc., and we're coming back to looking at the mess, the Pope is actually brought on. He has a silent cameo. He walks in at the background to represent, if you like, the future through the past. So that particular view of Catholicism is very different from the types of Catholicism you see, generally speaking, as part of the backlash towards decadence. And I think you need to be careful to make assumptions about this. But if you think, obviously, of Rizemont in terms of that particular conversion, it's very personal. I don't think we can necessarily see it as part of a particular trend. But what happened to people like Bourget, Barras, etc., a lot of the people who ended up being anti-Dreyfusards, the Catholicism was part of it. So it was linked to a certain reactionary view of the state, which wasn't necessarily going back to pre-revolutionary France, but it was also going back to a sense, well, there are certain traditions here, and we need to uphold them. So we have something which is seen as national, and there's a curious thing going on between official views of what is secular, but effectively de facto views of saying, we are a secular nation, but at the same time, we are a Catholic nation. But it's only, I think, seen in certain particular conservative writers, but it's definitely there. And there is a book, isn't there? You probably know, is it Eugen Weber, off the top of my head? or Hans, is it Decadence and Catholicism, which looks at some of these things.
Just to follow up on that, I think
another way. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
No, on you go.
Over to you, Michael. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, just to say another way we can approach this is how some writers and thinkers at the fin de siècle are moving away from that Protestant Catholic divide that dominates a lot of 19th century Scotland into new religions that allows them to be much more cosmopolitan. I'm thinking of Theosophy, for instance, and the number of Scottish writers who are really quite, even if they don't formally become Theosophists, they're fascinated by this religion that is kind of half American, half Buddhist and Eastern, and trying to fuse those things together. So yeah, it's sort of alternative religions become a means of entering a cosmopolitanism, perhaps.
Oh, I see that Michelle Foote has also pointed to that in some in the Q&A. Yeah, she talks about the transnational connections of Anglo-American modern spiritualism. Russell has a point from the Q&A about Geddes. Yeah. And could his activities be interpreted as largely civic, especially in Edinburgh? Mm-hmm. Geddes frames culture through a social, place-based lens, whereas summer schools as cultural exchange are more cosmopolitan. So actually drawing a distinction within Geddes' different types of activities there.
Yeah.
And then Scott Hames builds on something that I said about Casanova's World Republic of Letters, and talks about Casanova's, in parentheses, somewhat shaky reading of recent Scottish literary naturalism, the Glasgow School of the 1980s, which directly aligns Kelman Leonard with Whitman Twain as models for breaking with British literary language standards. He says, I think this highlights some weaknesses of her model, but it's still interesting. Okay. I think I might call it there. We've been going for an hour and 3/4, and there's another session at 4 o'clock where Linda Hughes is going to be giving a plenary talk about Andrew Lang. And we've had some fascinating discussions. So I want to say thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you very much to the audience who posted questions and been chatting. I like the quote from Voltaire from Fraser Riddell in the chat. He quotes Candide, il faut cultiver notre jardin, in relation to Geddes, which is interesting because obviously I think that's said by Panurge, and Panurge at that point is concluding that the thing to do is to ignore the rest of the world and just look at your own garden, whereas we've been looking at the way that Geddes' garden connected with the world in different ways. So yeah, as I say, there's another session at 4 o'clock when Linda K. Hughes will be joining us from Texas to talk about Andrew Lang. So thank you very much to the panelists. I'm hoping that if we can get the website up and running again, there have been some problems accessing it today for some people on some certain types of devices. There'll be a forum on there where we might be able to pursue some of these questions offline and continue the debate and discussion that's been so fruitful today. So thank you ever so much, especially to the panelists. Thank you to everyone for coming. And I'm going to end it there for everybody. So I give you my Zoom wave. Okay.
Thank you.